Hey guys, tonight we dim the lights and settle in for some seriously boring history for sleep, but let me warn you, this one might actually keep you awake. We're opening the pages of the secret journals, the quickly scribbled entries, and the often illegal diaries of the women who found themselves at the very heart of the Second World War, the nurses of WWII. You see yourself right now probably tucked into something soft.
Get this man stabilized. I need
Maybe
him
the
ready for
scent of
transport
essential
in 10.
oils lingering, the gentle whir of the fan, a perfect white noise. Now trade that for a tent pitched precariously close to an artillery battery. The air thick with a metallic cloying smell of antiseptic. And something much, much worse. Your uniform isn't crisp. It's stained with mud and blood. And your bed, if you're lucky, is a thin canvas cot inside a hut that shakes every time the big guns fire a mile away. You are young, idealistic, and you came for an adventure, maybe even a little glamour, but what you found was a relentless, soul-grinding routine that you probably won't survive, at least not intact. These aren't just stories of bandages and bedsides. They are the heartbreaking, unfiltered records of women who were trained to heal, but found themselves facing a tidal wave of destruction. And we're going to trace their steps from the cozy, almost normal wards of the Blitzed home front to the brutal heat of the Pacific prisoner of war camps, and even into the frozen, muddy chaos of the Battle of the Bulge. They wrote these words for themselves in secret using borrowed pencils and the backs of supply manifests, just trying to make sense of the sheer insanity of a world falling apart around them. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you are tonight and what the local time is in the comments below. It's always fun to see how far these quiet stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a young woman in 1940, and the news is always a static-laced nightmare on the radio. The world is on fire, and you're stuck doing the laundry or taking temperatures in a civilian hospital. Maybe you're Elfrida Geisman in Brisbane, a trainee nurse whose first diary entries are mostly about trying to pay off a department store debt for a new handbag, and complaining that her meager wage of $24.85 for the fortnight isn't enough to sustain her sartorial dreams. It's a sweet, relatable life, a life on pause. Then the war begins to bite, and a sense of duty, patriotism, or perhaps just a desperate need for something more than the mundane settles in. You sign up full of a naive, youthful idealism that now feels incredibly heavy, like carrying a lead cape. The recruitment posters promised adventure, maybe a chance to travel to the glamorous-sounding Middle East or the exotic Pacific. Many of you joined the Army, Nurse Corps, the Navy. Nurse Corps, or the Cadet Nurse Corps, all convinced you'll be fixing minor scrapes on heroes. The mainstream historical fact here is that the U.S. Army Nurse Corps swelled from fewer than 7,000 nurses in 1941 to over 57,000 by 1945. It was a massive sudden mobilization of an essential female workforce. In your mind, it's a noble Florence Nightingale pursuit. But the diaries reflect a starker truth. You're leaving behind the familiar. Your mother's garden, your fiancé, the idea of a predictable future, and stepping onto a troop ship with 1,900 men as Canadian nursing sister Kay Christie did, feeling less like a respected professional and more like a curious, highly scrutinized novelty. Her diary notes how she and her colleague were affectionately or maybe dismissively referred to as 1975 plus 2. That's a gentle introduction to the gender dynamics you'll be facing. You arrive overseas, and the expected adventure immediately turns into hard physical labor. Imagine Nurse Ruth Dorsman landing at Omaha Beach just 6 days after D-Day. You're sleeping in a foxhole for the first few nights, and your first job is not a complex surgical assist, but simply helping to set up a brand new 400-bed evacuation hospital. On the first day, you admit 525 patients. That arithmetic alone should tell you the story. The numbers don't add up, and they never will. You're immediately doing the work of 3 people every single day. The hook that holds you is the sheer scale of the suffering, but also the realization that your training is suddenly irrelevant to the need. In a field hospital, the strict hierarchy of the civilian world dissolves. When casualties pour in faster than the doctors can manage, you start administering blood transfusions, a task that pre-war only a doctor was authorized to perform. The rulebook is tossed into the mud. You are the last line, the one with the needle, the one with the morphine. You become the critical decision-maker on the fly. This massive expansion of the nurse's role, born out of necessity, is a profound and quirky tidbit that often gets lost in the larger narrative of battlefield heroics. Nurses, by saving lives with unauthorized procedures, essentially laid the groundwork for advanced practice nursing roles decades later. You write a quick, almost frantic entry in your diary on a stolen page. We had no beds for them. Had to put stretchers on the floor. This simple sentence, found in the records of a Red Cross nurse, crystallizes the shock. The hospital you run isn't a hospital at all. It's a processing center for human wreckage. You're not healing. You're stemming the tide. And then there's the pervasive, bone-deep physical misery. Your living quarters are often a shared damp tent or a damaged shack. The toilets, the diary of one nurse serving near the front lines in Europe describes it perfectly, a slit trench. The idea was to straddle it and squat, she writes. In the rain, it fills with water and mud, and one memorable, mortifying day, your chief nurse slips and falls kerplunk right into the excreta. You can't help but let out a muffled laugh even as the absurdity of your situation. A professional commissioned officer bathing from a helmet and using a muddy hole sinks in. You live on K rations, crackers, a tin of potted meat, and that rock-hard, heavily vitaminized chocolate that the Army insisted was essential, but tasted, frankly, like sweetened despair. You start to think, is this what I gave up a life of hats and dances for? The weight of the war is not just the wounded, but the constant low-level physical hardship. You only get 1 canteen of water a day. You're chronically cold. Your legs ache from 12-hour shifts that stretch to 18. You haven't shaved since January. Just kidding, that was the soldiers. But the point remains, you've traded comfort for chaos, and the diaries are your only space to admit that you're tired, you're scared, and sometimes you just miss a decent glass of cold milk, an impossible luxury that the folks back home take for granted, as one nurse noted with weary sarcasm. Historians still argue whether the expansion of military nursing was primarily driven by the professional ambitions of the nurses themselves or simply a military necessity imposed by the colossal scale of casualties. But regardless of the why, the effect was undeniable. You are forced to become infinitely more capable, infinitely faster than any civilian hospital would ever have allowed. It's an exhausting, terrifying privilege. You fold your stained uniform. You try to wash the mud from your face in a helmet of cold water, and you know with the certainty of a woman who has seen the worst of humanity that you are no longer the same person who stepped onto that troop ship. The innocence, that thin white veil of youthful idealism you brought with you, is shredded almost instantly. It doesn't take a battlefield to do it. Sometimes all it takes is one night under the bombs. You're moved out of the relative calm of your initial posting, perhaps, to a city plunged into the darkness of the Blitz. You are now a home front nurse, dealing not with the neat surgical wounds of a soldier, but the gruesome, random destruction visited upon civilians' children, grandmothers, milkmen. The bombing raid arrives with a sound that's impossible to ignore. The low, vibrating drone of enemy planes, followed by the terrifying, distinctive scream of a falling bomb. Then the silence, and then the hospital doors fly open. One nurse's diary entry recalls one of her earliest experiences during the London Blitz, the casualties, from a single stick of bombs falling on a residential area. Everyone is dazed, cut by flying glass. The sheer overwhelming number of tiny, painful wounds is a shock. She wrote about removing over 200 glass particles from one casualty alone. This early chaos, the unexpected nature of the injuries, is a mainstream historical fact. Of the Blitz, it took trial and error and the bitter lessons of World War I veterans to figure out simple things like taping windows to mitigate the flying shards. It seems absurd now that such basic safety measures had to be learned in the worst possible way, but in the panic of the early war, everything was improvised. The reality of your new environment is brutal. You're working 12-hour shifts, sometimes stretching to 20, and you're constantly exhausted. You're forced to train for gas warfare, wearing full protective gear except for a proper respirator and laboring for 2 hours straight after your regular shift. You're heavy lifting, sweating, and trying to master decontamination procedures in a civilian gas mask not designed for labor. The lack of proper equipment is a constant gnawing worry. You write a tired entry in your journal, maybe with a small wry joke to keep your spirits up. If the Germans ever drop mustard gas, I think I'll be safer in bed with the covers over my head than trying to get into this contraption again. My lungs complained, but my feet ached louder. You learn quickly that hospitals are not sanctuaries. They are targets. A Canadian nurse in Hong Kong, Kay Christie, recounts her experience after Pearl Harbor. Their British military hospital was used as target practice, sustaining 111 direct hits on the buildings and grounds. The air raid siren was hit early on, meaning you got no warning at all, just the sound of planes overhead and the immediate explosion. You, the nurse, are literally on the front line, dodging shrapnel and flying masonry as you tend to the wounded. This leads to a strange, almost surreal, quirky tidbit about how you adapt. In some hospitals in advanced areas, nurses were ordered to dye their crisp white ward dresses with strong tea or coffee. Why? Because the clean, bright white was considered too visible from the air, making the hospital a better target for enemy pilots. Imagine the institutional absurdity of that your professional standard of pristine whiteness is now a death sentence, and you're forced to make a battlefield brew to save your life. It's an act of defiance and desperation, a weird domestic way of fighting back. But the biggest strain isn't the physical danger, it's the emotional one. You are dealing with death, yes, but often the sudden, senseless death of people who should have been safe. A young serviceman, quiet and uncomplaining, dug out of a bombed-out hotel, his eyes filled with dust and dirt. Your last act, before you move on to your next assignment, is to gently irrigate his eyes so that he can see again. It is a profoundly intimate human moment, a final connection to humanity before you leave the home front for the unknown. The diaries, however, reveal that there's a limit to how much horror you can process. You develop a kind of emotional callousing, a survival mechanism. An American nurse writing in France during World War I, but whose experience echoes into W.W. Canto notes, I always have a curious sense of impersonality in these affairs. You see the men come in, you see them leave, and you know statistically many are heading back to die. Yet immediately after a gut-wrenching goodbye to a soldier you genuinely cared for, you go out with friends and had the time of my life. This immediate switch, this compartmentalization, is something you rely on. Historians still argue whether this psychological switch-off was a sign of emotional trauma and dissociation, or a necessary, rational, professional defense mechanism that allowed nurses to function under impossible stress. Either way, you learn to use it. You laugh at the joke your chief nurse made about falling in the slit trench. You fuss over a small, personal detail like the debt for your handbag, and you deliberately seek out those moments of lightness, if only to convince yourself that the world still holds some sweetness and normal human joy. Because if you allow yourself to truly feel the weight of the wounds, the terror of the bombing, and the endless black beetle line of ambulances snaking towards your hospital, you know you will break, and you simply cannot afford to break. The line of stretchers waits. You have to save the laughing for later, or you won't save anyone at all. Now that the immediate blinding shock of the first casualties has worn off, your daily life becomes a grim lesson in logistical failure. The adventure you signed up for has boiled down to a relentless, frustrating scramble for essential supplies. The diaries from every theater of war, from the muddy fields of Normandy to the sweltering heat of the Pacific, all share this single, desperate refrain: there is never enough. You are trying to save lives, but you are constantly constrained by the mundane bureaucratic reality of war. Forget penicillin. Sometimes you lack the basic dressings. A Canadian nurse on a troop ship headed for the chaos of Hong Kong notes that the two nurses aboard were told to go out and buy all the summer clothes they could find because they were heading somewhere hot. This is a quirky tidbit that perfectly encapsulates the Army's approach: throw people at the problem first, figure out the supply chain later. Imagine the absurdity of trying to shop for tropical gear in October, knowing you are sailing into a war zone. The lack of supplies means you are forced into continuous, exhausting improvisation. You read one entry from a nurse in France: "Had to boil and reuse bandages today. The linen is threadbare and we're cutting up old sheets for dressings. If matron saw the state of this ward, she'd have a stroke. But the men keep living, so we keep cutting." The lack of beds is a recurring nightmare, as you already know. When the convoys arrive, winding over the roads like black beetles crawling, as one nurse vividly described them, the casualties are simply dumped onto the floor. You're working amidst the groans of wounded men with gaping, filthy wounds, sometimes with shrapnel still lodged deep, and your back is busted in two from bending over stretchers on the stone floor. Even your own living conditions are a constant source of quiet misery. We talked about the slit trenches. But what about sleeping? An American nurse crossing the English Channel, part of a convoy heading to the continent, describes the accommodations for 105 nurses on a British ship. They were told all the cabins were gone, and they'd be sleeping in the crew's mess hall in the very bottom of the ship. They slept in 3 layers hammocks for the upper crude wooden mess tables for the middle and the floor for the lower. The British officer cheerfully calls them jolly good sports. You smile politely, but your diary entry for the night is probably a little less charitable. You are an officer now, but you are treated like cargo. Food is another constant source of grievance and a low-level threat to your health. The diaries are full of complaints about the dreaded D rations, thick, heavy, sweet chocolate bars that were packed with vitamins but nearly impossible to choke down. If you couldn't eat it, you melted it into hot chocolate. The K rations, which had hardtack crackers and a tin of potted meat, felt like a feast in comparison. For the nurses taken prisoner in the Philippines, like Helen Louise Gardner, Rosmus, the diet quickly degraded to almost nothing. No meat. I'm back to fish and rice. No sugar. The constant gnawing hunger is a profound entry in her journal that encapsulates the years of captivity. This obsession with meager food, which seems so trivial against the backdrop of war injuries, is a mainstream historical fact of the period. Rationing was a global reality, and the military supply lines were often inefficient or cut entirely. Your entire existence is pared down to the absolute essentials. The monotony is as draining as the work. When you're not in a rush, you're waiting. The Army system of moving you somewhere just to wait for a port for a convoy for the front line to move creates an almost unbearable boredom. So you sing. Another nurse's diary mentions that because she had voice training, she was often called upon to sing requests at twilight. They sang popular tunes, but also clever, rude, or weary songs they made up themselves, turning their grievances into art. You learn to be deeply suspicious of authority, of bureaucracy, of the sheer waste inherent in the military system. Historians still argue whether the high level of improvisation seen in WWII, nursing forced by supply chain failures, ultimately led to better, more innovative patient care, or simply imposed an unjust and dangerous burden on the nurses. It's a debate between necessity and neglect. But for you on the ground, that improvisation is simply survival. You use your ingenuity, your training, and your sheer stubbornness to hold the line against chaos. You are the one who starts the unauthorized blood transfusion. You are the one who cleans and reuses the cotton. You are the one, perhaps, who decides to sneak a wounded soldier an extra square of that awful derationed chocolate because, well, he needs it more than you do, and anyway, you prefer the cheese spread. The most heartbreaking part of the logistical nightmare is realizing that the only thing separating your patients from death is your willingness to break the rules. The sheer logistical weight of managing a field hospital is one thing, but nothing prepares you for the reality of caring for patients while simultaneously being a potential casualty. Now we turn to the diaries from the most exposed locations, places where the front line was less a line and more a frantic fluid perimeter. We are talking about places like Anzio, Italy in 1944. You arrive in Anzio as part of the initial landing forces, and immediately you're not just a nurse, you're an enlisted officer digging a hole in the ground. The mainstream historical fact is that the Allied foothold at Anzio was perilously close to the German lines, making the evacuation and station hospitals dangerously exposed. Army nurses there were famously photographed digging their own foxholes just outside their tents. You are told this is a necessity, a way to bolster the spirits of the men who see their nurses enduring the same tough conditions. But your diary records a far more personal reality. Imagine kneeling in the cold, hard earth, scraping out a shallow trench with your helmet or a makeshift shovel. Your diary entry written after dark might read, "The mud here is a special kind of cold. Dug my hole today, tried to make it wide enough for two just in case. The sound of the German shells, the Anzio Express, is like a train that never stops, and it goes right over your head." It's hard to remember to be professional when you're praying for a direct hit on the latrine trench instead of the operating tent. The shell fire is constant, creating a specific kind of nerve-shredding terror. You are working in a tent, the canvas flapping in the wind, and suddenly the earth shakes. Dust and dirt fall from the tent poles. The patients, already grievously wounded, flinch with every blast. Yet you have to project a calm, professional facade. One nurse recalls treating patients under shell fire, administering aid, while listening to the explosions. The patients are already weak, and the noise and vibration only compound their misery. The proximity of death is a tangible thing, a constant whining presence. And then there are the patients whose wounds aren't visible. You begin to see an increasing number of men suffering from what the doctors call shell shock or battle exhaustion. Today, we would recognize it as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Their symptoms are terrifying sudden paralysis, uncontrollable, shaking inability to speak, or flashes of unadulterated terror. In your diary, you note the heartbreak of treating a fully intact, physically healthy young man who simply stares through you. You might write, "Brought in a lieutenant today. No physical wounds. The man is gone. He just weeps and rocks. We try to keep him warm, give him quiet, but what bandage heals the mind? The doctors say it's the nerves, but it looks like the soul has been scraped clean out of him." This psychological trauma, the emotional cost of combat, was poorly understood at the time. The treatment was often basic, including enforced rest, or in some cases a shaming return to the front. The nurse's role became deeply maternal and psychological. You're the one sitting by the cot, holding a hand trying to coax a spoonful of broth into a mouth that won't open. This shift from physical triage to profound emotional care is a testament to your adaptability. The quirky tidbit about this era is that the nurse's unwavering professionalism and ability to function under fire did more than just save bodies. It became a profound psychological support for the troops. When a soldier saw his nurse calmly changing a dressing while a shell landed 50 yards away, that stoicism gave him permission to hold on to his own sanity. It created an atmosphere of improbable stability in the heart of chaos. Historians still argue whether the designation of shell shock allowed the military to avoid confronting the true systemic brutality of modern warfare, or if it was the earliest imperfect attempt to recognize that the human psyche has limits. The diaries, however, present the raw human truth that these invisible wounds were just as devastating as the shrapnel and gunshot injuries. You find a strange kind of liberation in the absolute necessity of your situation. You're doing things no woman back home would ever conceive of. You are in command. You are resilient. You are tough. As the shell fire rattles the tent poles and the air smells of smoke and fear, you look at the terrified young face of a patient, and you realize, I am the last person standing, and I have to be the strongest. That responsibility anchors you, prevents you from diving headfirst into your own foxhole and never coming out. You survive Anzio Day by terrifying day, not just because you're lucky, but because the need to care is stronger than the urge to flee. From the freezing, muddy trenches of Europe, we now turn our attention to an experience that is perhaps the most notorious and heartbreaking chapter in the WWII nurse diaries, the fall of the Philippines and the captivity of the American Angels in White. The environment you're now operating in is the exact opposite of Anzio. It's the suffocating humid heat of the Pacific, specifically Bataan and Corregidor in 1942. You are one of 99 American Army and Navy nurses caught in the Japanese invasion. Initially, it was a paradise assignment, as one of them, Helen Louise Gardner Rosmus, noted in her diary. What a life. We worked half days, and we were almost overrun with parties. Parties. This small, quirky tidbit of early frivolity makes the subsequent descent into horror even more stark. The parties stop abruptly with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. You find yourself retreating with the American and Filipino forces, first to the jungles of Bataan, then to the fortress island of Corregidor. You are working in vast underground lateral tunnels, the Malinta Tunnel, which were hastily converted into subterranean hospitals. This is a mainstream historical fact. These tunnels became a claustrophobic, deafening refuge constantly rocked by shelling from above. You are operating by the dim light of lanterns, the air thick with sweat, and the smell of gunpowder trying to treat wounds when the supply ships have long since stopped coming. Your diary entries during this siege are frantic, brief, and tinged with fatalism. Shelling is non-stop. We are so far underground I feel like a worm, but still the ceiling shakes. Use the last of the quinine. Praying for a miracle, but settling for a few hours of quiet sleep. The ultimate heartbreak arrives with the surrender. You are marched out of the tunnels and become a prisoner of war, POW. 77 Army nurses and 12 Navy nurses were interned for 34 months primarily at the Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. The reality of the camp is starvation disease and the constant crushing surveillance of your captors. Your professional status as a nurse is all that saves you, but it's also the reason your ordeal is so unrelenting. You are the sole medical staff for thousands of civilian and military internees. Your focus shifts entirely from treating combat wounds to fighting an entirely new set of enemies, beriberi, dysentery, malaria, and the gnawing hunger that makes every day an act of will. Nurse Rasmus's diary perfectly captures the brutal simplicity of life I'll never forget, flying the white flag. No meat. I'm back to fish and rice. No sugar. Things are going from bad to worse. The weight loss is staggering, the energy level nil. Yet somehow you maintain a semblance of professional care. You, along with your colleagues, set up a makeshift hospital inside the camp. You are treating patients in a 12-foot room, bare and bullet-holed, trying to keep up sanitation, in a place crawling with centipedes and flying cockroaches. The diary becomes a record of the tiny, momentous victories of human ingenuity against the forces of decay. You note the pride when the men in the camp manage to spruce up their appearance before the nurses arrive, or when they craft biscuits, thin, hard cushions to keep you off the floor. These are the small, essential acts of courtesy and solidarity that keep hope alive. You endure the 3 long years not knowing if the war is still going on, fearing you might be bombed by your own American forces or murdered by the Japanese guards in a final act of desperation. This leads to a profound reflection that historians still argue whether the exceptional unity and survival rate of the American nurses in Santo Tomas was a result of their pre-existing professional cohesion and discipline, or a simple, fierce maternal instinct to protect the helpless patients entrusted to their care. It was likely both a synergy of training and will. You cling to those tiny triumphs, an infrequent, almost unreadable letter from home, a new friend made in the misery, the knowledge that another patient made it through the night because of your care. You never stop being a nurse, even when you are starving, even when you are surrounded by despair. That professional identity is your armor and your reason for continuing. When the American troops finally liberate the camp, you are weak and skeletal, but you are marching out your duty fulfilled. If the experience of the American nurses in the Philippines was one of long, grinding survival, the fate of many Australian and other Allied nurses in the Pacific was an abrupt, devastating tragedy. We now turn to one of the most brutal chapters recorded in the history of WWII, the story of the nurses on the Viner Brook and the Bangka Island Massacre. It is February 1942, and the fall of Singapore is imminent. You are one of 65 Australian Army Nursing Service AANS nurses hastily evacuated on a small coastal steamer, the SS Viner Brook. You're crammed onto the ship with hundreds of others, soldiers, civilians, women, and children, all fleeing the rapidly advancing Japanese Imperial Army. Your diary, perhaps written in the few quiet hours on deck as the ship cuts through the dark, warm water, might be filled with hope. Left Singapore today. The city was a nightmare of flames and noise. On the ship now, smells of diesel and salt. praying this journey is quick. Maybe this is the end of the fear, maybe a temporary peace. That hope is violently shattered 2 days later. On February the 14th, near Bangka Island, the Unvarnished Brook is bombed by Japanese aircraft. This is a mainstream historical fact. The vessel sank in about 30 minutes. The chaos is immediate and total. You are thrust into the oily, churning sea. 12 nurses are lost in the sinking. You, along with many others, manage to swim for hours, clinging to wreckage or ropes until you wash ashore on Raji Beach on Bangka Island. You are part of a group of about 80 survivors, including 22 nurses. Your first instinct is professional. You are a nurse, and there are wounded men, soldiers from the Unvarnished Brook, and other sunken ships mixed in with the exhausted civilians. You immediately establish a makeshift hospital on the beach using salvaged supplies and your sheer willpower. One of the nurses, Sister Lainey Balfour Ogilvy, who learned to swim in the Murray River, was described as encouraging and assisting others in the water. That deep-seated sense of duty immediately surfaces the moment your feet hit the sand. Your diary entry, if you could write one in those moments, would be about triage, not terror. Landed on sand, exhausted, everyone helping. Set up a little shade for the worst casualties. Japanese soldiers sighted in the distance. We decided to wait. We have no weapons, and we are clearly marked as non-combatants. After 2 agonizing days of caring for the wounded, you decide to formally surrender to the group of Japanese soldiers who have arrived. You are a hospital unit, clearly identifiable under the Geneva Convention. You believe your status as medical personnel will afford you protection. The Japanese separate the men from the women. The men, the remaining wounded, and civilian men, are taken behind a bluff, and minutes later the soldiers return, wiping their bayonets. Then comes the order. The 22 remaining nurses, including the young and brave Sister Minnie Hodgson, are forced to walk into the sea. As they wade into the water, the Japanese soldiers open fire, machine gunning them from behind. 21 nurses are murdered in what became known as the Bangka Island Massacre. Only one nurse survives. Vivian Bullwinkle. She is grazed by a bullet and feigns death, eventually crawling back to the jungle to hide before being captured later and spending 3 years as a POW. Her chilling, solitary survival is a powerful, quirky tidbit in this tragic story. She was the sole witness who later testified to the massacre. The diaries of those who died, of course, end with the sinking. The entries from those who were later rescued from internment camps, however, detail the emotional toll this massacre took on them. News of such atrocities traveled often through coded whispers, adding a layer of paralyzing fear to their captivity. Historians still argue whether the systematic targeting and execution of medical personnel, which occurred in several theaters of the Pacific War, stemmed purely from a violation of international law, or was a deliberate military tactic intended to sow terror and undermine the enemy's morale and ability to care for its wounded. Whatever the answer for the nurses, the line between combatant and non-combatant completely dissolved. You, the reader of this history, must understand the silence of those final diaries. They end on a note of professional duty and naive hope, cut short by an act of unimaginable cruelty. Their last words were not written in a moment of despair, but in the performance of their duty, a final heartbreaking testament to their commitment as nurses, even to their last breath. You've seen the sheer physical terror, the logistical chaos, and the outright tragedy of the war. Now let's dig into the true emotional cost. The thing that makes these documents so heartbreaking, the daily inventory of grief. This is the core of the nurse's diary, the place where she records not the number of casualties, but the weight of each individual life lost. Your life is a continuous loop of high-stress work, followed by a brief fitful rest, only to be dragged back into the ward where men are dying. The most difficult moment, the one that tears at the protective shell you've so carefully constructed, is often the last conscious request of a patient. The diaries are filled with these small, shattering duties. The soldier, barely old enough to shave, knows he isn't making it. He asks you to write a letter home, a final message to his mother or his young wife. You sit down often after your shift is officially over and take dictation. You are not a pen pal. You are a scribe of sorrow. You have to capture his voice, his humor, and his love, all while knowing this message is the final thing his family will ever receive from him. You write about his bravery, his good spirits, and you leave out the parts about his screaming his pain and the frantic attempts to save him that failed only moments before. One nurse's entry might read, "Stayed late again. Wrote 3 letters. The last one was for the corporal from Tennessee. He made me promise to tell his girl, Lily, that he thought the nurse was pretty, but he only had eyes for her." I wrote that down exactly. The whole ward was quiet afterwards. You seal the envelope and you want to scream, but you just put it on the desk and walk out. Duty done. This job of standing in as the proxy family, the one who witnesses the end and carries the final messages, is a profound and mainstream historical fact of wartime nursing. It was part of the unspoken emotional labor that was never listed on their job description. Nurses became the keepers of last words and the writers of noble lies. To cope, you resort to intense compartmentalization. You have to file away the image of the dying man before the next convoy arrives. You separate your professional self from your feeling self. You might notice in your own diary a jarring switch. One sentence is about a horrific casualty, a wound so massive you can barely describe it, and the next might be about the quality of the sugar ration or a funny spat you had with the matron. This emotional whiplash is your survival strategy. There's a profound, quirky tidbit in this, the concept of the death board. In some hospitals, particularly those run by the British or Australians, nurses and doctors, would subtly and sometimes overtly gamble on which wounded soldier would survive the night. It sounds monstrous, but it was often a dark coping mechanism, a way to reframe the inevitability of death as a matter of statistics rather than emotional connection. It allowed them a moment of black humor and intellectual detachment before they had to face the reality of the loss. You, however, find your release in quiet, small acts, like polishing your boots, until they shine a tiny, controllable piece of order in the chaos. The weight of the war is not just the wounds, but the constant procession of youth. A nurse serving during the Battle of the Bulge remarked on the pain of seeing how badly injured the young patients were. But what made her feel even worse was seeing that they were wearing a wedding ring. That small piece of metal instantly conjured a whole world. You were about to extinguish a wife, a hopeful future, a house they'd never finish building. Historians still argue whether the high rates of emotional suppression demanded by wartime nursing contributed directly to long-term psychological disorders after the war, or if the very act of constant caring created an emotional resilience that aided their later recovery. For you in the moment, it doesn't matter. You know that if you let the grief in you will be paralyzed, and the next soldier, the one you can save, will die because you stopped to cry. So you don't cry. You fold the letter, address the envelope, and you turn your attention to the next simpler need. Maybe one of the boys needs a shave, or perhaps just a cup of that weak, lukewarm tea. You save the profound sorrow for the few seconds before you fall asleep, hoping that the exhaustion will win the race against the grief. In a world defined by the big, horrifying headlines, the major offensives, the sunk ships, the fall of cities, the diaries offer you an escape hatch into the small, unexpected moments of normalcy. This is where the profound power of the mundane resides. When everything around you is chaos and death, a shared laugh over a bad meal or a fleeting moment of beauty becomes an act of psychological resistance. You've just finished a shift where you watched a young man die from a wound you couldn't close. The tent still smells of ether and burnt cordite. But your next diary entry is not about the dying. It's about a new pair of gloves or a rare sighting of fresh flowers. For instance, the diary of an Australian nurse stationed in Egypt or France might note finding some wild flowers to pick even amidst the mud and the mess. This is a profound, almost quirky tidbit. The insistence on domesticity, on beauty, on the tiny routines that anchor you to the world that exists outside the ward. These diaries are full of the secret economy of simple comfort. You are an officer, a trained professional, but your entries sound like a teenager trying to organize a slumber party. A single tin of condensed milk is a treasure. During the Boer War, one nurse wrote that one tin had to last 9 of them for a month, an experience echoed by nurses in WWII, who jealously guarded tiny rations. In the Pacific camps, finding a functional sewing needle or a length of fabric to make a new dress became a major event, meticulously recorded as a triumph over scarcity. You're fighting a war not just with scalpels, but with scissors and thread. The most universal comfort, however, is food. While you complain bitterly about the D-rations, a sudden, unexpected culinary success is celebrated like a military victory. Maybe you managed to trade some army gear with a local farmer for a few fresh eggs, or a friend managed to scrounge up some forgotten cocoa powder. You might write, a miracle occurred. Sergeant Jones found a tin of real coffee. We brewed it up over a fire in the latrine area, don't ask, and for 10 minutes it was almost like being back in a cafe. The mud tasted less muddy after that. These tiny feasts were not just about nourishment. They were about reclaiming your humanity, proving that you could still conjure a moment of civilization in the barbarity. And then there's the escape of romance and friendship. Mary Morris, a nurse serving in Europe, wrote about the constant cycle of meeting handsome, charming officers, and then having to say a sudden, wrenching goodbye as they were called back to the front. She noted, "I always seem to be saying goodbye to men whom I might have loved had there been enough time." The war forces you into these condensed, intense relationships, a fleeting flirtation in a jeep, a shared dinner in a shelled-out building, a quick, desperate kiss under the cover of a blackout. These moments are brief, but they are vital sparks of life and passion against the gray backdrop of death. It's easy to dismiss these entries as frivolous, but they represent a mainstream historical fact of survival psychology humor, and small acts of defiance against despair are critical coping mechanisms. By focusing on a new hat or a funny joke from a patient, you are consciously pushing the horror of the day to the background. This brings up a key question that historians still argue, whether the relative freedom and independence nurses experienced, being away from strict parental control and operating in a system where traditional rules were constantly broken, created a temporary, liberating cultural shift for women, or if the intense, compressed nature of wartime flirtations led to greater emotional distress when those relationships inevitably ended. But for you, sipping that precious, bitter cup of real coffee or admiring the pattern on your newly made dress, the debate is irrelevant. This brief, stolen moment of sweetness is your armor for the next shift. You know that if you can still laugh, if you can still desire a normal life, then the war has not completely won. You hold on to the mundane because it is the strongest evidence that a life worth returning to still exists. The intense, often prolonged contact between the nurses and the wounded soldiers inevitably created deep, complex relationships. The wards you managed were not just sterile rooms for healing. They were temporary, closed societies where the rules of the outside world melted away. The diaries are rich with observations about this nurse-patient dynamic, a blend of professional duty, fierce mothering, and sometimes forbidden affection. You become the surrogate mother-sister and confidant for scores of young men facing their mortality. For them, you are a powerful symbol of the life they left behind and the hope of the life they might return to. You might write in your journal, "The boys are so young." Sometimes they call me Mom when they're feverish. It's hard not to treat them like children, even the ones who are lieutenants and captains. This maternal role is a mainstream historical fact. Nurses often took on the role of emotional caretaker, writing to parents, soothing nightmares and enforcing discipline with a gentle authority that doctors rarely possessed. You are the one who knows their preferences, their pain levels, and their secret fears. You are the only stable female figure in a world dominated by male trauma. But the relationship is never purely clinical. You are young, and so are they. Flirtation, a gentle, necessary part of reclaiming normalcy, often blossomed in the sterile, high-stakes environment of the ward. A small, cheeky joke, a bit of extra attention, a shared cigarette when the matron isn't looking, these were the small fires that kept the emotional cold at bay. One nurse's entry captures this delicate balance. Hilly is a trial. He says he is in love and won't take no for an answer. I have to be cold to him, which feels cruel, but I can't let the line blur. He's too vulnerable, and frankly, so am I. But he did sneak me an extra piece of fruit from the mess. I ate it and smiled, but kept my distance. You flirt to survive, not to commit. This kind of diary entry is a perfect example of the professional tightrope you walked, managing the emotional needs of the men without compromising your professional integrity or your own safety. The soldiers, for their part, often regarded the nurses with a mixture of reverence and deep respect. They saw the nurses' unwavering courage and knew they were enduring the same dangers. A quirky tidbit is that in some field units, the enlisted men and corpsmen would go to great lengths to build or improve the nurses' quarters or latrines using scavenged materials, seeing it as an act of protective devotion. They saw you as their protector, and they, in turn, wanted to protect you from the war's worst privations. This sense of fierce loyalty could also manifest as a kind of possessiveness, especially in the close quarters of a forward hospital. You were, after all, a rare commodity. The diaries contain brief, often coded references to unwelcome advances or the difficulty of maintaining boundaries with men who were facing life and death daily. The war's compressed timeline made everything more intense, more immediate, and far more complicated. Historians still argue whether the professional and emotional bond forged between nurses and patients on the front lines ultimately served to elevate the status of military nurses after the war by proving their capacity for leadership and emotional resilience, or if the intensity of those wartime roles led to a greater difficulty in readjusting to the more restrained professional boundaries of civilian life. For you standing at the foot of a young patient's bed, the debate is abstract. You are their link to civilization, their only source of comfort, and their constant reminder that some things care compassion, and the promise of a future are worth fighting for. You sign your diary off with a weary flourish, knowing that tomorrow you'll face the same exhausting mix of blood jokes and delicate, unspoken affection. You are their angel, but you are also just a woman doing a job under impossible circumstances. While most nurses operated in stationary hospitals, field units, or prisoner camps, a specialized few found themselves fighting the war against gravity and time. We now turn to the diary entries of the flight nurses, the women who turned unstable, unpressurized transport planes into flying ambulances. This is the definition of high-stakes nursing, and the records are terrifyingly concise. You are a flight nurse, part of an innovation born from necessity. The mainstream historical fact here is that the U.S. Army Air Forces introduced flight nurses to rapidly evacuate wounded soldiers from the front lines to larger, safer hospitals, dramatically reducing patient mortality. The record is staggering. Army flight nurses helped to establish an incredible safety record with only 5 deaths per 100,000 patients flown. This was a revolution in wartime medicine. Your environment is a stripped-down C-47 transport plane, often called the Goonie bird. There are no pristine, climate-controlled cabins here. The aircraft is cold, loud, and constantly vibrating. You are responsible for scores of patients, strapped into tiered canvas, litters their wounds, freshes their condition, precarious. You might write, "The noise is deafening and the cold bites through the blanket." Administered morphine to the boy in the middle litter, he keeps trying to sit up. Have to tie down the IV bags. It is nursing by sheer brute force and prayer, 10,000 feet up. The actual act of flying is an extreme physiological challenge, particularly for the injured. You're dealing with the effects of altitude on wounded bodies. Air trapped inside body cavities from chest wounds or abdominal injuries expands at altitude, causing agonizing pain and potentially death. It's a medical issue called gas expansion. A quirky tidbit is that flight nurses had to be hyper-aware of a simple physical phenomenon and constantly monitor patients for signs of increased internal pressure, a unique concern unknown to nurses on the ground. The diaries capture the stomach-churning instability of the flights. You are not just dealing with turbulence. You're dealing with aggressive, life-threatening air pockets. One nurse wrote about these sudden drops. At times during the flight, we would hit an air pocket and drop several hundred feet in the air like falling in an elevator. It took a little while for our stomachs to catch up with us. Imagine managing a blood transfusion or trying to splint a broken leg when the floor suddenly drops out from under you. You must maintain professional calm while your own body is in freefall. Your uniform is an olive drab flight suit and your gear is basic. You administer oxygen change bandages and continuously monitor IVs in a moving, freezing metal tube. The flights are often continuous from France to Scotland or from islands in the Pacific back to base hospitals. There is no rest. The emotional intensity is compounded by the speed of the trauma. You receive the patient straight from the field, often still in shock, and you deliver them to safety, a brief, vital connection in the middle of their journey of survival. Historians still argue whether the professional and public recognition that followed the success of the flight nurses, whose bravery was highly publicized, was genuinely about acknowledging their medical contributions, or if it was a tactical propaganda effort to showcase female courage in a highly visible way and encourage further recruitment into the nurse corps. For you strapped into the shuddering Goonie bird, the debate is moot. The success of the mission, the proof that you are part of a revolution in trauma care, lies in the life of every soldier you safely deliver. You look out the tiny window at the clouds rushing by, and you write your final entry before landing. Touched down safely in England. Offloaded 17 men, all stable. One more day where gravity didn't win, and neither did the German artillery. Tired, but flying always feels like a victory. In the high-stakes, chaotic environment of a wartime hospital, the diary became more than just a personal record. It was a defiant act of self-preservation. You weren't just writing your life, you were hiding it. This leads us into the fascinating, frustrating world of censorship secrets and scrutiny that permeated every aspect of a nurse's service. Military regulations, particularly in forward areas or prisoner of war camps, often explicitly forbade the keeping of detailed diaries. The reason was simple. They contained sensitive, potentially morale-damaging information that could fall into enemy hands or be used for undesirable press coverage back home. To keep a diary, then, was to break the rules to risk punishment and to commit to the meticulous use of coded language. You learn to become an expert in understatement and omission. If a German shell landed 50 yards from the operating theater, you wouldn't write, "We nearly died when the shell hit." Instead, your entry might be a masterpiece of bureaucratic banality. Quiet evening, but experienced some unexpected noise near the west tent. Required minor structural adjustments. This use of vague or technical language to describe life and death events is a mainstream historical fact of wartime correspondence and journals. You are constantly filtering your own experience through a lens of mandatory optimism and military correctness. The most sensitive details, however, required even deeper secrecy. In one nurse's diary from Australia, Joan Taylor, she prefaced certain entries with telling phrases like "private information" or "not in newspapers." This is a gold mine for historians and a key quirky tidbit for us. This private information often concerned local incidents that were suppressed by wartime censorship to prevent panic or damage morale, incidents of civilian violence, rumors of atrocities or inflated casualty numbers from air raids that the official reports downplayed. For example, she records an allegation under private information that 2 black soldiers were shot in Brisbane for attacking women, and later notes that witnesses claimed many were killed in a Townsville raid despite official denials. You, the nurse, are often the unintended recipient of true messy, uncensored news from corpsmen, from local contacts, from the soldiers themselves, and your diary becomes the only safe place to record these truths that challenge the sanitized version of the war. The physical act of hiding the diary became a high art. You couldn't just leave it on your cot. Diaries were hidden in bedrolls, sewn into the linings of uniforms, or tucked into the false bottoms of trunks that had miraculously followed you across oceans. For the nurses who became POWs, like those from the Bangka Island sinking who survived internment keeping a diary, was an act of extraordinary defiance. The penalty for being caught was severe, yet they continued to record their thoughts and observations on scraps of paper, sometimes using vegetable dyes or salvaged ink. This brings up a crucial debate. Historians still argue whether the self-censorship and coded language found in the diaries were a successful protective measure for the nurses and their information, or if the very act of censoring one's own trauma by immediately neutralizing the emotional language contributed to the long-term emotional suppression and difficulty in processing their experiences later in life. For you in the dim light of your tent, the simple fact is that this journal is your anchor. It's the one place where you can be honest, even if that honesty must be wrapped in metaphor and euphemism. It is your silent revolt against the system that demands your physical sacrifice, and sometimes your intellectual surrender. You finish your entry, hide the book deep inside your kit, and hope that tomorrow's reality is less censorable than today's. As we continue to read between the lines of these fragile records, we come to the most difficult subject, one often referred to only in whispers code or through deliberate blanks, the unspoken scars of sexual violence. While the diaries are generally PG-13, the reality of war, particularly in occupied territories and prisoner camps, included the constant threat and sometimes the brutal reality of assault. You are a woman far from home, in an environment of total male control, and your diary is the only place you can even hint at the atmosphere of danger. For the nurses in the Pacific, particularly those captured in Hong Kong or interned in the Philippines, the threat was palpable. One nurse's entry, Kay Christie, recounts the harrowing situation at a raided auxiliary hospital where Japanese soldiers separated the younger female volunteers from the older ones with the tragic consequence of multiple assaults and murders. This is a chilling, documented, mainstream historical fact of the Pacific theater. Your own diary entry might not use explicit language, but it might convey the tension of a situation. You might write, "Had to be very cold to the guard today. A look too long. Keep my head down, keep my hands busy." The matron reminds us to never be alone, even for a second. The solidarity is our only shield. The focus shifts from physical injuries of the patients to the constant unseen vigilance required for your own survival. There are also the entries that hint at the complex reality of coercive dynamics. In places like occupied China or the Philippines, some local women, and tragically some nurses, especially those who were starving and desperate, were forced into relationships with captors or exploitative exchanges for food and protection. The diary entries about this are never accusatory, but they are suffused with a sense of moral grayness and profound sadness. You are writing about the cost of survival, where the line between choice and desperation dissolves. A crucial, quirky tidbit in how this fear was managed is the phenomenon of collective protection. In the internment camps, the nurses stuck together, moving in groups, creating their own self-enforced rules of behavior, and deliberately projecting a hyper-professional, almost desexualized persona. This unified front acted as a deterrent, making it clear that an offense against one would be an offense against the entire, fiercely protective community of women. This brings us to a major point of scholarly contention. Historians still argue whether the relative silence in the official records and published post-war memoirs regarding sexual violence was due primarily to institutional censorship and the societal taboos of the era, or if the nurses consciously chose to omit these stories to preserve their own dignity and focus the narrative on their professional heroism and resilience. You, the keeper of the secret, know that the truth is often too ugly to commit to paper, even if it's coded. You worry not just about your diary being found, but about the shame of those words. But the fear is real, and the silent code in your journal, the quick, sharp notations about a guard's gaze or the insistence on moving in pairs is the profound secret record of an emotional wound deeper than any shrapnel could inflict. You close the book and pray for another day of unmolested service. The war ends not with a quiet surrender, but with a sudden, cacophonous burst of celebration. For you, the nurse, this moment should be pure joy, but the transition from the constant life or death intensity of the front line to the baffling stillness of peace is deeply disorienting. You begin the struggle with post-war silence and the unfinished story. You are one of the heroes returning home, but you quickly realize the gulf between your reality and the civilian experience is wider than the oceans you crossed. The mainstream historical fact is that the process of demobilization was rapid and for many deeply unsettling. You step off the ship or the hospital train and people are cheering, but they are cheering for an idea of you, a brave, selfless angel, not for the exhausted, emotionally scarred woman you actually are. You try to talk about it. You try to share the story of the slit trench or the sound of the Anzio Express or the smell of gangrene that you can't seem to wash out of your fatigues. But the response is polite bewilderment. One POW nurse, Kay Christie, recounts the infuriating, heartbreaking disconnect. She mentioned to an elderly woman that she sometimes couldn't sleep because the hunger pangs were so bad. The woman's response, "Why didn't she just go to the refrigerator and get herself a nice glass of cold milk? That single innocent question summarizes the profound failure of communication. The people back home had no real idea. They processed the war through newspapers, ration books, and sanitized official reports. They could not grasp the reality of a world where a glass of cold milk was an impossible, forgotten luxury. Your diary entries from this period are characterized by a weary sense of deflation. Back in Toronto, everything is too bright, too clean, too soft. Tried to explain to my cousin about the tunnels in Corregidor, and she just asked if the uniforms were flattering. I stopped talking then. How do you tell someone you watched 3 men bleed out on a canvas litter suspended from the ceiling? The silence is imposed not just by the lack of understanding, but by a sense of self-protection. You realize that to truly explain the horrors, the Bangka Island Massacre, the forced death marches of your patients, the constant proximity of death, would be to burden these people with a truth they aren't equipped to handle. So you keep the story locked inside your journal, which now becomes a vault for the unspeakable. This period of forced silence is a quirky tidbit that often appears in the nurses' later reflections, the realization that their greatest sacrifice was not physical, but the sacrifice of their story. They had to choose between being understood and fitting back into society. Most chose the latter, adopting a narrative of cheerful patriotism and minimizing their trauma. The professional adjustment is equally jarring. You are suddenly back in a world of strict hierarchy where your battlefield innovations, starting a blood transfusion, managing a ward of 50 men single-handedly, are dismissed as exceptions. You return to a role where a doctor must sign off on every minor procedure, a crushing step backward after years of autonomous life-saving. Historians still argue whether the immediate post-war institutional demand for nurses to return to traditional subordinate female roles was a societal reaction to reestablish gender norms after the disruption of the war, or if it was a failure of the medical establishment to recognize and integrate the advanced trauma-honed skills that military service had forced them to acquire. You pack away the stained uniform and the diary. The notebook is now your secret history, the truest account of what you saw. You know the war is over for the world, but for you, the fight to process the memory of the wards has just begun, and you have to fight it alone in the silence of your own clean, quiet room. Though the parades ended and the uniform was put away, the war didn't actually end for you. It simply moved inside, becoming what we can call the long echo of the ward. Your experience, vividly recorded in the diaries, was not just a period of service. It was a profound, irreversible education that left both psychological and professional scars. The psychological toll was immense. While shell shock was the term used for the soldiers' emotional wounds, the nurses faced their own version of unnamed trauma. You carry the images of the operating table, the smells, and the sheer volume of human suffering. In the post-war era, there was very little understanding of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The expectation was simple. You were tough. You survived. Now move on. Your diary, however, holds the proof that you didn't just move on. Entries hint at the classic symptoms of trauma difficulty, sleeping, hypervigilance, and a deep-seated fear of sudden, loud noises. You might write, "The sound of a car backfiring today made me jump right out of my skin. For a moment, I was back in Anzio. I had to go into the kitchen and hold a teacup to stop my hand from shaking. It's been 6 months since I left the service, and the sound of peace is louder than the war." This persistence of the war environment in your memory is a crucial part of the story. The paradox is that while the war wounded you emotionally, it also created an unprecedented surge in your professional legacy. That necessity you faced on the front lines, the need to improvise, became the seed of innovation. The diaries inadvertently chronicle several mainstream historical facts that revolutionized post-war medicine, shock management. Your tireless work with blood transfusions and fluid management in the field tasks previously reserved for doctors greatly advanced the understanding and treatment of surgical shock. Recovery wards. The high-intensity immediate postoperative care you provided in forward evacuation units led directly to the concept of the recovery ward, what we now call the PACU, or post-anesthesia care unit, in civilian hospitals. You proved that intense, dedicated care in the immediate aftermath of surgery dramatically improved outcomes. Air evacuation. The flight nurses whom we talked about pioneered the entire practice of air ambulance transport, which is a standard of trauma care worldwide today. This is where we find a fantastic, quirky tidbit. The nurses' refusal to abandon patients during sudden evacuations or under fire meant they gained unparalleled experience in making critical, independent medical decisions. Their forced autonomy, which would have been scandalous in a pre-war hospital, made them some of the most skilled trauma nurses in the world. Historians still argue whether the professional gains made by women in nursing during WWII, the increased autonomy officer status and recognition of advanced skills were genuinely transformative for the long-term status of the profession, or if those gains were largely symbolic and quickly eroded by post-war societal pressure to restore the pre-war patriarchal order in medicine. But for you looking at your old diary, you know your service mattered. You saved lives, not only in the chaos of the moment, but also through the innovations you were forced to implement. You are part of the long, silent history of medical progress, even if the gratitude back home often felt hollow. The true value of your service isn't measured in parades, but in the knowledge that because of what you endured, thousands of future casualties would have a better chance of survival. We've traveled through the mud, the chaos, and the heartbreak contained within the journals of these extraordinary women. Now we arrive at the final page, the culmination of your service, and the enduring truth of what you left behind, the legacy of endurance. The real unvarnished story of the WWII nurse is not found in the official histories or the propaganda films. It is here in the small, worn notebooks filled with hasty script and smudged ink. These diaries are the most heartbreaking because they are the raw, unedited testament to self-sacrifice, chronicling the journey from naive volunteer to hardened professional in the space of a few hundred pages. The mainstream historical fact is that these diaries, often illegal and nearly always self-censored, are now considered primary source material essential for understanding the true human cost of the war. They provide the invaluable counter-narrative to the soldier's memoir, a story of sustaining life rather than taking it. They speak to the profound impact of having women in the combat zone, not as supporting players, but as essential, life-saving personnel operating under direct fire. Your ultimate legacy, scribbled in code and quiet desperation, is one of resilience. You not only survived the bombing, the shelling, the starvation, and the emotional trauma. You actively maintained a standard of care that defied the circumstances. You adapted. You improvised. You laughed at the absurdity of the exploding latrine and then calmly saved a life 5 minutes later. There is a final, touching, quirky tidbit found in some of the post-war diary entries and letters. Many nurses, upon returning home, found that the friendships they had forged with the other women, the shared terror in the foxholes, the collective protection in the POW camps, the bond over that secret tin of coffee, were the deepest, most enduring relationships of their lives. These women continued to meet share-coded glances about the unspeakable, and offer the silent total understanding that only another wartime nurse could provide. Your diary becomes not just a private document, but a key to a secret society of survivors. Historians still argue whether the greatest contribution of the WE2 nurses was the reduction of battlefield mortality, a quantifiable metric, or the demonstration of female courage and professional competence under extreme duress, which permanently altered the public perception and professional future of nursing. For you reading your own final entry, it is likely none of these grand conclusions. It is simply the quiet knowledge that you did your job. You stood your ground when the world collapsed around you. You bore witness. You closed your diary with a simple, tired final note, perhaps just a date and a period, and you let the silence of the page speak for the years of noise. The final page of your diary is turned. The journey is over. The war is a memory, and yet it is one that will never fade. Your endurance, the quiet courage written between the lines, is a story that time can't erase. The quiet settles now, and the sound of my voice begins to soften, easing back from the stark realities we've just faced. The images we conjured, the canvas cots, the shaking tents, the faint scent of antiseptic on the night air, they begin to recede, now blurring at the edges, becoming just colors and shapes in the dark behind your eyes. You can let go of the names, the places, the dates. They are safe now, tucked into the historical record, their lessons learned, their pain, finally at rest. Close your mind to the sharp edges of the wartime world. The sirens are silent. The shelling has stopped. There is only the soft, gentle presence of the dark and the smooth certainty of the covers around you. Take a slow, deep breath, holding onto the air for just a moment, and then letting it all drift away. You are warm, you are safe, and the only battle you need to win now is the one for a deep, restorative sleep. The nurses did their duty, and now you have done yours by listening to their story. You can thank them for their courage with a quiet mind and a peaceful heart. May your dreams be soft, uncluttered, and filled with the quiet comfort of home. Rest now. Sweet dreams.